I was going to do a Bobby Boucher reference, but Adam Sandler accents haven't been funny for 2 decades. Sorry. Hello and welcome to Intoxicated Masculinity. If it's Wednesday, we have a cocktail video coming at you today. I was looking through Gary Regan's Joy of Mixology and I came across a cocktail called the Bobby Burns. And he references back to the old Waldorf Astoria cocktail book, which calls the Robert Burns. And it's just kind of a fun little Scotch cocktail that I was kind of interested in. There are several different variations of this. I believe the cocktail was created at the Waldorf Astoria sometime either during Prohibition, illicitly, or very, very shortly thereafter. Again, as it first appears in the old Waldorf Astoria cocktail book in 1935. Not really sure the specific date of the specific person who created it, but again, I'm a big fan of Scotch, big fan of Scotch cocktails, and there's not tons of those out there, so I thought this would be a fun one to kind of mess with. So let's talk a little bit less about the history and a little more about putting it into our faces. All right, we're back and we've got some ingredients, and right away we have one ingredient that is somewhat in doubt. So I'm using Gary Regan's recipe. Gary Regan calls for Benedictine. The original recipe calls for absinthe. I've also heard this recipe calling for Drambuie. You're using very little of this ingredient, whichever one you choose. So I'm going to go with this one. I think this is kind of interesting. I don't see tons and tons of cocktails that call for Benedictine, and I happen to like Benedictine, so that's what I'm going to go with. But let's start off. We're going to go, and by the way, you might notice I have 2 bottles of Scotch on the table. That is because, honestly, until this moment, I have not decided. I've only got 2 bottles of Scotch in the house right now. I don't drink a ton of Scotch on its own. And so usually I'll have 1 bottle of peated Scotch, and then we keep 1 bottle around for a family member who comes down sometimes. So I've got some Johnny Walker Black Label, and I've got Lafroig. Very much kind of 2 ends of a spectrum if you're making this cocktail, and it kind of depends on your taste. But let's start off with our sweet vermouth. I've got Carpano Formula Antica. And you kind of notice this cocktail resembles a Manhattan a little bit, except obviously we're not using rye whiskey, we're using Scotch. And I think we're going to toss in, it says a dash. I'm not dashing in Benedictine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to toss in about 1/8 of an ounce, just a little bit. I think maybe call it a heavy dash or heavy bar spoon. And finally, to decide which Scotch we are using, I'm going to go ahead and use the Lafroig. If you're not a fan of peated Scotches, don't use a peated Scotch in this cocktail because it will take over. My only worry with this is that it will completely take over the cocktail and that we won't taste our vermouth and we won't taste our Benedictine. But I think it's worth the effort. So I'm going to try this. If it turns out this is a little bit too peaty, we might change it up a little bit. It should be noted that Johnny Walker Black Label also does have elements of peated Scotch from Kalila Distillery on Isla. But here we go. We're tossing in 2 ounces of our chosen Scotch. Now, as you can see, the similarities between this and a Manhattan are pretty obvious. We're using 2 ounces of whiskey, Scotch instead of rye. We're using a dash of something. Here we're using Benedictine instead of bitters, and then 1 ounce of our sweet vermouth, which is pretty standard. Obviously, this is not really going to taste anything like a Manhattan, but in construction it is very similar. But let's go ahead and grab our ice. All right, so we got our ice in our mixing glass. Let's give this a good stir and get that cool down. As always with these stir drinks, good idea to just keep your finger sort of on the bottom of the mixing glass and sort of monitor the temperature. All right. Now this actually calls for being put into a coupe glass. I think this would actually kind of go equally well into a rocks glass with a big ice cube. I think you can do the same thing in Manhattan, but that's not sort of the traditional way of doing it, so we'll do it the way that tradition demands. Alrighty. And for a garnish, we're just going to toss in a lemon twist. Express that over the drink. Rub it on the rim and toss it in. And there, you have your Bobby Burns. Let's give it a try. That's really good, actually. So your sweet vermouth is temping down your peat just a little bit. This is still a very peated cocktail. So if you're afraid of peat, don't use peat in this. But I think the sweet vermouth is making it a little bit more palatable for most people. Again, I don't mind it. I don't mind it neat. The Benedictine is there. It's providing just a little bit of that herbaceousness, but it is just around the edges. It is a hint, which I think is what it should be in this cocktail. This shouldn't be a Benedictine heavy cocktail. This is just adding a little bit to it. I think looking back as far as Drambuie and absinthe, I think either one of those would be fine in this cocktail actually. You could even use your absinthe and just do a spray in the glass before you put it in the glass, and I think that'd be perfectly fine. One thing I forgot to mention about the history of the cocktail, the name of the cocktail actually has, there's some disagreement about. However, there was a brand of cigars that were available at the time called Robert Burns, and I think it's likely that's where this cocktail got its name. That's really good. That's very well balanced. I'm glad I went with Lefroy in this case. I think it was the right choice. Again, if you're real sensitive to peat, again, probably don't use it. But again, the sweet vermouth is doing a lot to kind of just tame that peatiness just a little bit. And that's quite good. Yeah, I enjoy that a lot. Again, it's sort of similar to a Manhattan in construction, but definitely not similar to a Manhattan in flavor. Flavor is completely different. But I like that quite a bit. And on that bombshell, I want to thank everybody for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. Have a good drink, and have a good day. If it's Wednesday, we have a cocktail book. We don't have a cocktail book coming every Wednesday.